Good afternoon, folks. This is going to be our hybrid content for this week concerning the features of nervous tissue. We are still in the same notes packet from this past week in lecture on nervous tissue, and we're picking up where we left off in class, having already discussed the general features of neurons and specifically of multipolar neurons. So we're going to pick up where we left off with that if you want to follow along with that packet from the other day. Now, having already laid out the basic features of a standard multipolar neuron, where we know about the basic cell body, the dendrites, the axon terminals, the nodes of Ranvier, the Schwann cells wrapping around the axon to form the myelin sheath, and so forth. I want to spell out a couple of variants on the basic neuron structure that can exist in different parts of the nervous system. So let me screen share for a minute here. Now, this is the structure we showed you the other day. This is a typical multipolar neuron that is found in most parts of the body. You've got the soma, you've got multiple dendrites, you've got one axon, hence multipolar, lots of different poles reaching out from it. But let's look at some alternative ways that we can organize our neuron. Here are some alternative neuron structures. And this is straight out of your handout, so you can always reference this later if you want. Here's your multipolar neuron down in the lower right here. Cell body, multiple dendrites, one axon, axon terminal at the end, synaptic terminals, or axon terminals at the ends there. Now, some variants you can have here. This here is a bipolar neuron. Your bipolar neuron has one dendrite, one axon. So there's one incoming afferent fiber bringing data into the axon, one outgoing efferent fiber carrying data away. Bipolar neurons are relatively rare. You don't find them in a lot of parts of the body. The bipolar neurons are really only associated with certain specialized nerve fibers attached to the special senses. Bipolar neurons are associated with some nerve fibers involving the olfactory membranes, that is, involving transmitting data from the sense of smell to the brain. Some limited areas involving the sense of hearing, and some limited areas associated with the retina of the eye. Those are the only places in the body that you're going to find bipolar neurons. So very, very limited involvement with the special senses of the body, the special senses of the head. Not a lot of places you're going to get those. Now here we're going to find another neuron structure. This is a unipolar neuron. Now, a unipolar neuron, if you want to be pedantic, is sometimes called a pseudo-unipolar neuron because technically it does have two nerve fibers. There is a dendrite and an axon, but the dendrite and the axon fuse together during their embryonic developments. Neither of them, as you can see, actually goes through the soma. They don't go through the cell body of the neuron. There's kind of this T-shaped branch where the dendrite and the axon fuse into one long fiber that bypasses the soma altogether. And basically, most of it is one long axon that just kind of bypasses the soma. Soma's off to the side. Signals come in through the dendrites and just whiz right on by. You find unipolar neurons associated with the spinal cord. They are utilized to broadcast data up and down the spinal cord for getting data to and from the brain. And that's the only place in the body that you're going to find unipolar neurons. And then last but not least, you're going to find this type of neuron right here, the anaxonic neuron. Prefix an means without. Anaxonic neurons are exclusively found in the central nervous system. Anaxonic neurons, as the name suggests, lack axons altogether. They have lots of dendrites, but they do not have an axon carrying signals away. Rather, anaxonic neurons communicate directly with other neurons around them through their dendrites touching each other's dendrites. This allows them to form complicated data exchanging networks with other neurons in their vicinity. Anaxonic neurons are exclusively interneurons. They are the association neurons that are involved with the central nervous system for exchanging data and allowing your brain to form ideas, to communicate signals from one neuron to another, to piece together the information coming in from the sensory neurons and figure out what's going on around you. The lack of axons and the lack of myelinated fibers directing signals in a specific direction basically means that these anaxonic neurons can freely exchange information with every other cell in their vicinity, which enables them to take in a vast amount of data and therefore get a more comprehensive picture of all the data streams coming into the brain in order to associate all of that data and therefore collectively get together with all the neurons in their vicinity to paint a comprehensive picture of all the information coming in and let your brain assemble the collective ideas from your senses to understand what is going on around you and put together all that information to do the complicated tasks that we associate with cognition, think about things, and help you arrive at conclusions and decisions. So the lack of focused, basically directionally wired signals is actually really good for what they do. It allows them to engage in free exchange of signals and information that lets you think through things and put ideas and information together. Now, for all of these kinds of neurons to work together, not every neuron is exchanging information the same way. Not every neuron is sending the same kinds of signals out. And in order to facilitate communication, we have to really think about how do we communicate different kinds of data? How does the brain know what kinds of information are being passed around? A lot of that comes down to what kind of chemical signal the nervous system is making use of. And here we're going to get to something that I've mentioned in here a couple of times now, but is really, really important for understanding nervous system function. And that is a kind of molecule called a neurotransmitter. Neurotransmitters are proteins that are manufactured by neurons, released by the presynaptic neuron at the end of the axon terminal, and picked up by receptors on the postsynaptic cell. Whether that postsynaptic cell is a muscle fiber, pardon me, whether that whether that postsynaptic cell is a gland, whether that postsynaptic cell is another neuron that's being communicated with. Now, you already know how this works because we talked about the neuromuscular junction a chapter or two ago. And that tells you that whenever these neurotransmitters are released, they bind to receptors on the other side of the synapse, and that initiates a change in the postsynaptic cell, causing that postsynaptic cell to do something new, to cause something else to happen on the far side of the receptor. Well, it turns out that depending on what neurotransmitter you're releasing, different things can happen. Not every part of the body uses all the same neurotransmitters, and it turns out a lot of them are exclusive to the brain and initiate changes that are happening only within the brain itself. Others are exclusive to the body as a whole and initiating changes that are happening only, for example, to muscles. So we have different kinds of neurotransmitters depending on what tasks different regions of the body or brain need to perform. There are many, many kinds of neurotransmitters, and different chemical signals will initiate different kinds of changes. And that includes initiating different kinds of emotional and psychological responses. I'm not going to get into every kind of neurotransmitter that the human body utilizes here. There are other classes you can take that deal with neurology or neuropsychology and so forth that deal with neurotransmitters in much greater detail. And if you get into higher level classes, you'll discuss some of those things. But in here, I just want to talk about a couple of the more well-known neurotransmitters, at least briefly, and the kind of signals that they send to the body. Some of them you already know about. We already, for example, have talked about the neurotransmitter acetylcholine, ACH. You already know that acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter that's utilized in your muscular system. It excites electrical changes in skeletal muscles and begins the process of initiating an action potential to make a muscle contract. You already know, of course, by now also that sometimes these receptors can be hijacked by other similarly shaped molecules, and that nicotine, for example, can bind to the same receptors as acetylcholine. So can caffeine, giving you jittery sensations when you consume too much of those things. Another neurotransmitter that you're all familiar with is the hormone, or actually the pair of hormones, epinephrine and norepinephrine. If you are unfamiliar with the names of those hormones, you know them better by the collective name that is sometimes given to them, adrenaline. Epinephrine and norepinephrine are the hormones that initiate the fight or flight response. They get the body ready for action. They initiate the sympathetic response that we talked about last time in the nervous system, speeding up the heart rates, speeding up breathing, increasing blood flow to muscles, to the lungs, heightening your awareness, basically getting the body ready for action, but simultaneously reducing the blood flow to your kidneys, to your digestive organs, and to other structures that don't need it as much when your body is preparing to act quickly when you're frightened, angry, aroused, or in other situations where muscular response is what's demanded. Now, some other neurotransmitters you might be familiar with that act primarily on the brain. You might be aware of a neurotransmitter called dopamine. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter that is involved in what is called reward learning behavior. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter that, when it binds to receptors in the brain, initiates a pleasurable feeling. It makes you feel good. Dopamine is involved in what we call reward learning behavior because your brain releases it when it does things it wants you to keep doing. It makes you feel good when you get a rush of dopamine. So your brain rewards you for doing things the body wants you to keep doing by giving you a rush of dopamine. It says, hey, that makes you feel good. Keep doing that, body. So we get a rush of dopamine when, for example, we eat good food. We get a rush of dopamine when we rest our bodies and give them a chance to recover from stuff. We get dopamine out of sleep. We get dopamine out of sex. We get dopamine out of things that the body basically wants you to keep on doing. Dopamine is also responsible for regulating a lot of our bodily responses attached to these things. It regulates mood. It regulates sleep. It regulates a lot of our responses involved in eating. It regulates our attention. It should come as a little surprise to you that deficiencies in dopamine are involved in problems such as insomnia, sleep disorders like that. Deficiencies in dopamine are involved in addiction disorders, and most famously, in ADHD. ADHD is essentially a dopamine disorder, folks, where the brain is scrambling, trying to get a rush of dopamine by fixating on whatever detail is present in the environment. It's a poorly named disorder, by the way, because ADHD is not actually inability to pay attention. It is the brain trying to find a source of dopamine by looking for something to pay attention to and looking for every detail in the environment that might give it that, and then rewarding you basically by focusing on something. Your brain's trying to pay attention to everything at once. That's the problem. And it was actually an adaptive response in our ancestors. That in our ancestors, ADHD was essentially the response that was useful in somebody in a hunter-gatherer community that was keeping watch. Somebody who was a guard, somebody who would be watching the rest of the group at night, for example, keeping watch for, wild animals or whatever. It's just that in our society that has a lot more stimulus, where we don't have to watch for, cave bears and smilodons and things like that, saber-toothed tiger, if you don't know that name, and we have constant sources of stimulus around us all the time that our hunter-gatherer ancestors didn't have. That thing that was a useful adaptive response in a much less stimulating world is really poorly suited to the world you live in right now. Another one you probably heard of, serotonin. Serotonin is a neurotransmitter that is our body's primary mood and metabolic regulator. It regulates our body temperature, your mood, your appetite, your metabolic rate, a lot of aspects of your libido, and a lot of your emotional responses, particularly related to anger, aggression, lust, and overall emotional temperaments. Imbalances in dopamine, too much or too little, are involved in a great many psychiatric disorders. Most notably, clinical depression, bipolar disorder, and schizophrenia. It should come as no surprise to you, perhaps, to learn that many psychedelic drugs, like LSD and mescaline, bind to the same receptor sites as serotonin and dopamine. Should also come as no surprise to you to learn that cannabinoids bind to some of these same receptor sites. Last but not least, a group of neurotransmitters that are very medically significant, the endorphins. The endorphins are your body's natural pain blockers. They are a group of molecules called analgesics. And when you hear about an analgesic, analgesics, by the way, you should be following along with the handout so you get the spellings for all these things. A lot of people mistake that, think, oh, anal. No, it has nothing to do with your butt. Analgesic means pain blocker. Endorphins are pain blocking molecules, is what they. And people hear endorphin and they think, oh, endorphin junkie, the guy who gets on the roller coaster and all that, because here's what's going on, An endorphin is a pain-blocking molecule, and it is released when your body expects you to be in pain. And you might be thinking, okay, why do I get the endorphin rush when I ride the roller coaster? Why do I get the endorphin rush when I'm playing basketball? Why do I get the endorphin rush in these situations that are not painful situations? But they are. Here's what's up. When you are interacting with the world around you, whether you know it or not, every interaction, every tap, every touch is potentially painful. Pain receptors are all over your body, and your body continually releases tiny amounts of these endorphins to block what would otherwise be the painful interactions that come with everyday life. Little tiny bouts that block what would otherwise just be the pain you experience from being alive, walking around, and touching things. You don't even know about that pain because of the tiny amounts of endorphins you experience all the time. Now, when you are exercising, when you're challenging yourself, you're putting more pressure on those pain receptors. You're working those muscles more. That would be painful. So, more endorphins are released. When your body is in fight or flight, when your body is undergoing a sympathetic response, your brain says, uh-oh, I'm in action mode. Action mode means I might experience injury. Things are going on that could result in me being hurt. So what does the body do? It releases more endorphins in anticipation of possible injury. Because that way, if you do get injured during whatever is causing the sympathetic response, the body is ready. And therefore, when you're in the middle of whatever is requiring the action, you're not suddenly crippled by the pain. You're not suddenly disabled in the middle of whatever is demanding action. Keeping in mind that we as a species evolved in the natural world out in the wilderness where action mode often meant, climbing over dangerous rocks and fighting wild animals to get our dinner and so forth, where being in action mode meant the difference between life and death. So not suddenly experiencing crippling pain in the middle of those kind of situations was a very, very important adaptation. So you release the extra endorphins to protect against that, so your body can absorb the pain and keep on going. Later, when you're done with your activity and the endorphins begin to die down, you say to yourself, damn, now it begins to hurt, right? You've all experienced this, You're done with your exercise, you're done with your workout, you're done with whatever it was that was demanding the heightened activity, and then the pain kicks in. Because that's when the endorphins begin to go away. But while it's happening, a thing can happen to us. Let's suppose you're not actually in danger. Let's suppose there's no actual source of pain or threats, and your body gets flooded with endorphins anyway. And they're all circulating in your system, potentially there to guard you against pain that doesn't happen. What happens is you end up feeling euphoric. You feel on top of the world. You feel this incredible rush. You feel this amazing high. You feel great. Anybody who's been an athlete has felt this. You felt in the zone while you're playing the game. You felt the runner's high, while you're in the middle of your workouts. You felt that incredible rush during sex. You felt that thrill on the roller coaster. Because while you're on the roller coaster, your body doesn't know you're not actually in danger. Your body knows you're plunging down a hill at hundreds of feet, 70 miles per hour. Your body says, oh no, I'm about to be injured a lot, releases lots of endorphins in anticipation of an impact that's never going to come. And when the impact doesn't come, but the endorphins are all there, you feel amazing. This is also why we love the scary movies and the haunted houses. Because they trigger all the danger sensors in our brains. They make all the endorphins flood your body, and you feel great. without ever being in real danger. And I'm going to make everybody uncomfortable for a second. This is why so many people like a little bit of pain during their sex. Because that little bit of pain associated with pleasure kicks off all those endorphins without putting the body in actual danger. That's where all that comes from, folks. It's basically kicking in the body's anti-pain danger response in situations without actual danger and without actual injury to cope with. Make sense? And that's why we enjoy things that frighten us. That's why we enjoy things that give us the simulation of danger without real danger. Now, here's the flip side of that. Most of our pain blocking medications binds to the same receptor sites as endorphins. Morphine, OxyContin, most of your narcotics. That also includes drugs like heroin, your opioids. And here's the thing. When you take them on a regular basis, your brain says, oh, there's enough of this in my body right now. I don't need to make it. And the body reduces the amount that it naturally produces. That means you have less available for day-to-day purposes. Remember how I said every one of us, every day of our lives, is walking around producing neurotransmitters to guard against the tiny amount of pain we experience all the time, every day of our lives, but don't know it because we have tiny amounts of neurotransmitters in our bodies all the time. This is how addiction begins. Because you experience that little bit protecting all the time. And then your body stops making that. And all of a sudden, everything hurts. Every touch, every interaction, every step, every contact, every experience. And it's physical as well as emotional, because your brain does not know the difference between physical and emotional pain. They are literally stimulated by the same things, and they use the same neurotransmitters. Your brain responds the same way to being smacked in the face as it does to finding out grandma died. Literally the same reactions, literally the same neurotransmitters. Imagine that the pain blocking mechanisms don't exist to handle even tiny shocks. And finding out your bus is late hits you with the same emotional impact as finding out that grandma died. Because you have no blocking mechanism to protect your brain. That's what addiction is like. Imagine touching a doorknob feels like hitting yourself in the hand with a hammer. That's what addiction is like. And this is the kind of thing we need to think about when we need to ask ourselves if we should or should not be sympathetic to people who get addicted. Because make no mistake, we don't understand the science of addiction. Because there are people who can get surgery, go home with a week's worth of painkillers, take painkillers for a week after their surgery, and be completely fine and go back to normal life. And there are people who can get surgery, go home with a week's worth of painkillers, and by the end of that week, be hopelessly addicted. And we have no idea why. Because we do not understand why the brains are wired the way they are. There are people who can try an illicit drug, do it every day for a month, and be like, not my thing, and walk away. There are people who can try that illicit drug once and become hopelessly addicted. And we do not know why. And if you are in the family of people who say, ah, they shouldn't have tried it, it's all their fault, ask yourself if you have ever in your entire life had a moment of weakness, and if you would like to find yourself in that kind of hell because you made one mistake once. And if that's a fair judgment, this is how our brains are wired. And once it's there, we don't understand fully how the wiring works yet. We're working on it, but we don't get there yet. And if you're coming away from this lesson with an understanding that a significant percentage of our emotional responses, a significant percentage of our psychological responses are a direct result of chemistry, and you're thinking, how much of my personality, how much of my emotional wiring is actually a result of neurotransmitters? The answer to that is quite a lot. An uncomfortable amount of that is a lot. Mental illness is physical illness, folks. Nobody likes to think about that. And if you're thinking that mental illness is in some way fundamentally different than physical illness, if you're thinking that being mentally ill is somebody who is not trying hard enough, if you're thinking that somebody who is depressed or whatever is somebody who just needs to try harder or behave differently, or that they can just paste on a smile and that it works differently in some way, ask yourself if you would say to somebody who is asthmatic, well, you just need to try to breathe better, or if you would ask somebody who is diabetic, well, you just need to try to make more insulin or something like that, because it is literally the same thing. It's all down to chemistry. Your personality, your emotions, they are a direct result of neurotransmitter chemicals. We don't like to confront the uncomfortable reality that a significant part of the people who we are is chemistry. And these chemicals are responsible for it. And the sooner we get over ourselves and think about it, the better off everybody's going to be medically and as a society. And if I sound like I am being a little bit biased here, yeah, maybe I am, because I've watched far too many of the people come through my classroom, come through my family, and so forth, judged for addiction, judged for mental illness, and judged for chemical reactions that are not their fault. And we can do better. You're all going into health fields. You can do better. Okay. Now, it's not all neurons. Neurons are only about 1 in 50 cells in nervous tissue. And neurons don't do it all alone. Just like any big organization, they have a lot of supportive staff. So neurons get a lot of help from other kinds of cells to carry out the functions that they do. And perhaps you saw that in this week's lab activity, at least I hope you did. But neurons get a lot of their functional assistance from a group of other cells collectively known as neuroglial cells, sometimes called glial cells or neuroglia. And the neuroglial cells are the supportive cells of the nervous system, which carry out miscellaneous functions to protect and assist neurons with their tasks. Neuroglial cells are found in both the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system, and they carry out a wide range of protection, support, and assistive tasks to make the nervous system do what it does. They don't transmit signals. Unlike neurons, they are regenerative. They're able to undergo mitosis and make new ones. And they outnumber neurons by, again, about 50 to 1. There are way more neuroglia than there are neurons in the nervous system. There are 6 known types of neuroglial cells to date, 2 of which are found in the peripheral nervous system, 4 of which are found in the central nervous system. So let's talk about those. Now, in the central nervous system, actually, let me pull up a diagram here, and this is straight out of today's handout. Okay, here are our various types of neuroglial cells. Here are our central nervous system neuroglial cells. On the left here, you see oligodendrocytes. It's a bit of a name for you, oligodendrocyte. Oligo means straight, dendro means branch, You can see why they're called that. They've got these long, straight arms or branches, which at the end will wrap around axons. Oligodendrocytes are these big, fat, bulbous cells with these long arm-like processes that extend away from them and wrap around the axons of neurons in the central nervous system. They're exclusively found in the brain and spinal cord. Oligodendrocytes do the same thing in the brain and spinal cord that Schwann cells do in the peripheral nervous system. They wrap around the axons and form sort of the insulation around, protecting them and making sure that electrical signals in those axons travel along the path that they're supposed to, don't ground out before they get where they need to go, and speed up signal transmission. They form what is called the myelin sheath of the nerve fibers in the central nervous system. Kind of a white, fatty covering that covers up those nerve fibers. We're going to talk more about the myelin sheaths of the nervous system in the near future, but like I said the other day, think of it as like the insulation around an electrical wire. Prevents the signal from grounding out prematurely, speeds up signal transmission. Now, in the central nervous system, you will find some parts of the neurons are covered by oligodendrocytes and will have this kind of white fatty covering over them. They're myelinated. We say that's the white matter of the brain and the spinal cord. Other parts of the central nervous system are not myelinated. The anaxonic neurons I talked about a little while ago are not myelinated because they don't have axons, and oligodendrocytes protect the axons. So the unmyelinated portions of the central nervous system form what's called the gray matter. So when we talk about gray matter in the brain, that's the portions that are not covered by oligodendrocytes. Now, it's very, very important, and we talk about the brain starting this coming week. We're going to talk about where the white matter and the gray matter are in the brain, but short version right now. The white matter is important to signal transmission within the brain and spinal cord, making sure that signals get directed where they need to go in the central nervous system, basically so the brain can talk to itself, so that the brain can get signals from one region to another and make sure that ideas are being put together the way they ought to be. There is a disorder in which oligodendrocytes begin to break down. That disorder is called multiple sclerosis, or MS. You've all heard of that, I am sure. In MS, the oligodendrocytes are breaking down and being replaced by scar tissue. In that situation, electrical signals ground out prematurely and are not transmitted properly. As a result, little by little, the brain begins to fail in its signal connections. MS leads to gradual degeneration of brain function. A lot of different problems can happen depending on where the scarification in the brain occurs. You can have nervous tremors, you can have speech defects, you can have neurological defects of various types, you can have episodes of blindness, you can have numbness or tingling in limbs, you can have mobility problems. Sometimes the issues are episodic, sometimes they are long-lasting. They tend to become more and more progressively serious over time. From the onset of the condition, MS is progressive and tends to get more and more serious. It is eventually going to be lethal. Typically, the patient will live anywhere between 7 and 32 years, depending on the severity of the condition and what parts of the brain are affected. We think it's an autoimmune disease caused by a viral infection, but we do not know specifically what's going on. The current hypothesis is that there is a virus that literally everyone is infected with, that it's found in the DNA of literally every primate, but that it only activates in a tiny percentage of the population for reasons we are not clear on, and that some people are genetically susceptible to it, other people are not. And there is no cure. There are medications that can slow its progression, and in the past year or two, we've had some breakthroughs on possible medications that may be able to arrest or even reverse the progression of the disease. But those things are still not available for widespread deployment. They're still in testing to make sure that they work the way we think they work. But right now, there is unfortunately no way to halt or reverse the progress of the condition. Other types of neuroglial cells we find in the central nervous system. We have astrocytes. Astrocytes are these kind of star-shaped cells. The prefix astro means star. Astrocytes, most important thing they do is they form a tight sheath around the cells of the brain, known as the blood-brain barrier. The blood-brain barrier is a sort of cellular filter that all of the blood passing through the brain basically has to go through. The blood-brain barrier ensures that foreign chemicals and bacteria do not enter the brain, that only the essential nutrients and chemicals that the brain requires get in, and only the essential things that need to exit the brain get out. We're going to say more about the blood-brain barrier in class this next week when we talk about the brain itself. But suffice to say, the astrocytes basically are the chemical guardians of the brain. They ensure that the brain's chemistry is defended against foreign chemicals that would be toxic to it and against microorganisms that would do the brain harm. There are very, very few things that get through the blood-brain barrier other than what the brain absolutely needs to get in and out. And the astrocytes are the basic guardians of the brain in that regard. Then we have microglia. Microglia, despite their name, are quite large cells. Microglia are actually a type of macrophage. And if you don't remember that term, macrophage, macrophages are going to be some of the immune cells of the body. Macrophages are basically the vacuum cleaners of the body. They gobble up anything we don't want there. They destroy microorganisms. They destroy dead cells. They destroy any foreign matter that has gotten into the central nervous system. They're found in high concentrations anywhere there has been an injury, an infection, a stroke, or other forms of brain damage. Actually, after a stroke, we can scan the brain and look at where there have been concentrations of microglia in an effort to find out where the damage from the stroke most took place. And last but not least, we have ependymal cells. Ependymal cells are these kind of cuboidal-looking cells. They resemble cuboidal epithelia. But they're going to be forming linings of the internal cavities of the brain and spinal cord. There are spaces inside the brain called ventricles. The ependymal cells line those cavities, and the ependymal cells continuously secrete a clear fluid known as cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF for short. CSF is a clear fluid that fills up the internal spaces of the brain and spinal cord, circulates over the outside surfaces of the brain and spinal cord, constantly cushions the brain and spinal cord, rinses away wastes and toxic molecules, circulates nutrients and gases, and helps to provide buoyancy and cushioning to the brain and spinal cord. We'll say more about its role when we talk about the brain later this week. But CSF is essential to healthy brain function. So those are the central nervous system neuroglial cells. In the peripheral nervous system, we have two types of neuroglial cells. One of them you've already heard about, the Schwann cells. Capitalize the S in Schwann cells, named after the great German anatomist Theodor Schwann, of which there are a few things in the body that bear his name. Theodor Schwann discovered the Schwann cells in the late 1800s when he was studying the structure of neurons. Schwann cells are wrapped around the axons of neurons in the peripheral nervous system. So they're only found in the peripheral nervous system. They wind their membrane around the axon again and again and again, forming a thick, fatty white layer known as the myelin sheath. That myelin sheath, or myelination, is again like an electrical insulation layer, speeding up signal transmission and preventing the electrical signal of the axon from grounding out before it gets where it needs to go. Then we have satellite cells. Satellite cells are these little tiny cells with lots of little branching processes sticking out from them. They get their names because they're often found clinging to the outside of ganglia. And you might recall a ganglion is a cluster of neurons, or specifically the cell bodies of neurons, found outside the central nervous system. Satellite cells cling to the outside of ganglia, so they're like satellites on the outside of a planet. Satellite cells, their function was unknown until fairly recently. We now know that satellite cells are basically microchemical regulators. They monitor the chemical environment around the ganglion, constantly monitoring for toxic molecules in the environment, regulating the levels of electrolytes, and basically tracking the chemistry around the neuron and regulating that chemistry so that the neuron has an ideal chemical environment to carry out its functions properly. So that's going to be our neuroglial cells. One last thing I want to say about the neuroglial cells, rather about the myelin sheaths. And this involves both oligodendrocytes and Schwann cells, because it's really kind of the same no matter where you are. These form the insulating layers around axons, whether you're in the central nervous system or the peripheral nervous system. That insulating layer, the myelin sheath, is about 80% lipid, about 20% protein. It develops during the adolescence of the child. Most of it is developing in the first couple of years of life. It is very, very important. Never put a child under the age of 3 on a low-fat diet unless a physician specifically advises them to do so. I know people are worried about fat babies, but don't worry about a fat baby. That child really, really, really needs those lipids coming in because they need to develop the myelin sheaths that are super important to the safety and development of their nervous system. Now, the myelin sheath is going to have a segmented appearance because of the individual oligodendrocytes or the individual Schwann cells. It's going to look like it's broken up into segments. The unmyelinated gaps in between are going to be the nodes of Ranvier that I mentioned the other day. The segments between them are sometimes called internodes. Sometimes the little axon collaterals that I mentioned will shoot off from an internode or shoot off from a node of Ranvier. But for the most part, your axon is a straight segment. Unmyelinated nerve fibers are going to have much slower signal transmission. We can measure this in the unmyelinated parts of the brain. Unmyelinated parts of the brain carry electrical signals at a rate of 3 to 15 meters per second. Sorry, not 3 to 15, about a maximum of up to 2 meters per second. My bad. Now, that doesn't matter in the brain itself, where basically the anaxonic neurons are trying to put together data for your thinking purposes, and they're exchanging data with the other neurons around them to piece signals together. They're not trying to rapidly transmit signals to and from different parts of the body. They're trying to put together sensory data that's already arrived at the brain with other nearby neurons to assemble the big picture. So they can transmit signals at a rate of 2 meters per second because they're basically talking to the neurons next to them. But when we want to get signals from one part of the body to another rapidly, we want to go much faster. Myelinated nerve fibers, which either transmit signals within the brain from one region of the brain to another, or from the brain down through the spinal cord and out to the rest of the body, carry signals way faster. Because like an insulated electrical wire, they keep the signal in the nerve fiber and therefore ensure that it goes rapidly from point of origin to point of destination. A small myelinated fiber might transmit a nerve signal as fast as 15 meters per second. A large myelinated fiber with a higher voltage might carry a signal as fast as 120 meters per second, which is the kind of speed we need to make sure that your body can react to stimuli as fast as it needs to. Okay, folks, that is what I have to say about nervous tissue. We have the fundamentals of that down. I'm going to be posting a quiz on this in the near future. You will have 1 week to complete that quiz, so I'll have that up until next Sunday night. The next time we get together in class, first thing I will do is I will take questions about any of this content if you have them, and then we will move on to beginning to discuss the brain itself and how the brain works, which I think is going to be a really cool discussion. And we're going to be having our first dissection of this semester in the near future, in which we start taking apart some brains. It'll be a good time. All right. I will see you all on Wednesday. Have a good rest of your week. Take care.